Hey everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the library this evening. My name is Renee, and I'm glad that y'all could join us. I'd also like to welcome those of you who are viewing the program via live stream. And if you would please note the feedback forms that are in your chairs. You could take a moment to share your thoughts with us. Your feedback helps us with future events. It's my pleasure to welcome Caitlin Ahrens to the library this evening. Caitlin is currently working on her Ph.D. in Space and Planetary Science at the University of Arkansas. She helped plan and build the Pluto Laboratory at the Arkansas Center for Planetary Simulations and now manages it. Caitlin has received a patent on earthquake forecasting methodology, has won multiple prestigious awards, and in addition to her current research, she's a NASA Solar System Ambassador. Caitlin also guest hosts a mini radio show with local NPR station KUAF 91.3 called Scratching the Surface. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin.
All righty. Welcome to the final section of the Space Lecture Series here at the Fayetteville Public Library. I'm so happy you guys can make it here. This is the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. So the planetary community that I'm a part of is just buzzing around and frantically trying to figure out, like, okay, lunar science, we've kind of ignored it for several years worth. It kind of went into a lull of research and whatnot, and now that the anniversary is popping up, it's like, oh yeah, lunar science, that's a thing. Let's try to bring that back up. And there's just all this lunar science is starting to just kind of pop out of nowhere. And now other countries are starting to wanting to hop on board with lunar science as well. So we had the Bereshit with the Israeli space private company as well. Unfortunately, the first Bereshit crashed into the moon as of late. That was only just a couple weeks ago, if you've had heard of that. Yep. But they are sending a second one, so hooray! They learned from their mistakes, and they're planning a second one already. The Chinese have already sent off several probes. They sent the U-2 rover as well. It's working great. They had a science experiment going, and they learned from their mistakes as well. But indeed, but for us, however, it's nice to look back as to how far we've come from where we all started, and then essentially the Apollo 11 mission, the one to really bring us our first step forward, literally, on the moon. So we're going to go into a little bit of brief lunar science just to get kind of in the mindset of like, oh, look, it's a pretty moon. So why bother? It's like, well, it is really quite pretty. It is a very interesting natural satellite. So what I mean by natural satellite is because it has truly been birthed out of the Earth. So what we're thinking is that you have the Earth and then something about the size of Mars, so just a little less than half of the size of Earth, just went right into Earth. And then from the crust of a very early Earth, just kind of accreted and snowballed into what we have, the moon. So what's interesting about our moon, though, not only is it that kind of natural satellite, but it's because of the size. The size of our moon compared to our Earth is actually quite rare, all right? And then having a terrestrial satellite or a terrestrial planet of our solar system, having a moon of that size or even having a moon at all is still rare. Mercury doesn't have a moon. Venus doesn't have the moon. Mars technically has 2 moons, but those are not natural satellites. Those are captured asteroids. So having an Earth, having a natural satellite like this is quite rare. And then it goes into studies of like, well, what happens if exo-Earths, so Earths of other solar systems would have moons as well, and then it spins into this huge theory of, well, it could be, but maybe, you know, if it's rare for our planet, it might be rare for other planets too. So that's just a whole branch of science from there. So with the moon, it obviously not a natural pretty glow like this either. It does reflect sunlight. You see these really dark features. We call those mare. So mare is Latin for oceans. For the longest time, we truly thought that those were oceans on the moon. And then there were actually, back in the 1600s, 1500s, 1600s, there would actually be pieces of fiction that would have sailboats sail across these lunar oceans. So much to our dismay, surprise, it's not oceans. It's very much solid. Now, what is interesting is that these are still mysterious to us. Okay, we know that they're not oceans, check that off. We know that they're solid, okay, check that off as well. But we're still learning about the moon, so I'll get more into what there still is to study about the moon. And another thing too is that we are in tidal lock, which means we only see this side of the moon. So, welcome Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. It's like, well, that's kind of true, actually. We don't see the other side of the moon unless we travel there. So what I mean by tidal lock is essentially almost like like two kids in the playground holding hands, and they're just spinning around and around and around. They're always facing each other as they're spinning. Essentially, Earth and the moon do that as well. Then you have the lovely moon phases. You may have seen certain diagrams like this as well. So when you have the full moon completely reflecting the sunlight over here in nice alignment, you have the full moon. New moon is where you have the moon come up during right at noon during the daylight. So new moon, that's why you don't see the moon at night. Now, if the moon were over here, that's what we would call the apocalypse. Thank you for laughing at that. Another side note here is that notice it's never at this kind of perfect alignment either. If it were in perfect alignment, we would have solar eclipses and lunar eclipses constantly every single month. But in fact, we don't. In the US, it's actually quite rare to even have total solar eclipses every 2 to 4 years worth. Our next total solar eclipse is actually going to go right through Arkansas in 2024. So get ready for that. Get ready for that. It's going right through Arkansas. But why this is because the moon actually just doesn't go around the Earth willy-nilly. It actually acts like a carousel. It bobs up and down as it's going around the Earth. So what happens is that while it's neither going up or going down, just right, very Goldilocks-like, is where you get the eclipses. So right in that sweet spot, when it's in full moon, you get your lunar eclipse, so it turns into a beautiful blood moon, bright red, really pretty. And then new moon, you would get your solar eclipse. Who got to see the solar eclipse? Hard to believe that was just a couple years ago, right? Yeah. All right. All right, so now for the fun part then. What sparked our interest in the first place? We've always had this interest of the moon before, especially through literature, like I said, through the silent era of films in the 1920s. Everyone remembers the lunar face and the rocket hits it into the eyeball and whatnot. So we've always had this fascination with the moon, but now it's a driving force of, okay, we want to get there. So we finally have the space race. So space race between us and the Soviet Union lasted quite a while, from 57 to 75. Now keep in mind that NASA was founded in 1958. So very, very, very early baby NASA at this time, but it was a huge goal, a very anxious goal. We would have the Mercury and Gemini missions, so you would have smaller capsules launch humans up into like a low Earth orbit, try to see how far they can get around the Earth and then splash down and everything's fine. So let's just take that a tiny step forward and try to actually get to the moon. Another reason for the space race is mainly the symbolic of technological superiority. All right, so who can get there the fastest, the most efficient, who had the better technology, all right? And by all means, we're pretty much still doing that now in modern times. But at this point, it's actually getting to the moon. So it really did begin 1957 with the Sputnik 1 launch. So tiny little guy, this was actually only the size of a pretty good sized beach ball. So many people think that this thing is so large. It really isn't. It's actually only this big. Really quite tiny little guy. But when it launched, it went into kind of a scary scenario where the US was like, oh goodness, the Soviet Union already has their first satellite up in space. They're going to spy on us, and then it's going to get into reconnaissance, and then we need to step up our game. And it just kind of spiraled into either pure panic or excitement. No gray area. So we finally had the Apollo program, thankfully presented by President Kennedy in 1961. So our very first Apollo, unfortunately, failed. So 1966, it unfortunately exploded with the command module. So we unfortunately lost our 3 astronauts, White, Grissom, and Chaffee. So they never made it off the ground, unfortunately. So with that Apollo 1 incident, it just completely went into, okay, we are not ready. We are not that ready to send humans up. We need to do more testing. So Apollo 2 through 6, which surprisingly was only lasting for 2 years, but it was a constant mission after mission after mission of tests. Make sure that the instruments were correct, make sure that all the safety was there, make sure that we were able to do communications with that particular mission as well. So 2 through 6 was completely unmanned, but for safety reasons. Finally, Apollo 7 actually had the first manned spatial mission, so it didn't actually leave Earth's orbit entirely, but at least launch them up, bring them back down alive. Everything's fine. And then you finally have Apollo 8 through 10 with either manned missions to orbit the moon or orbit the Earth. So I really like this one, though. So not only do you have going around the moon and coming back, but it's Apollo 8. It looks like the 8. So that's probably my favorite mission patch. So then finally, Apollo 11. So I'm going to go through some of the parts that are involved, kind of like a Lego set here. You have the command module. So this tiny deal, and you can see command modules in almost any space museum in the nation here. So they're really quite fascinating to see how cramped they truly were in this tiny command module to kind of jettison off and hopefully return back safely, though. So this little tiny compartment contained the astronauts looking on the inside. They had months and months and years of training for this. So this is basically where if I would be sitting on the chair and looking up. So every single knob and button is not there for decoration. I can guarantee you that. So it's really quite fascinating to see all the knobs and buttons there. Next piece here is the service module. So you would have just almost like their living quarters in a sense. It has all their supplies. It has all the safety equipment if anything were to go wrong. It had the oxygen storage as well. You gotta breathe. Gotta breathe in that small living space. Going through some of the transcripts from the Apollo 11, it got interesting that it got so cramped still that they truly were fine just finding a corner and just kind of huddling in a corner and sleeping there. So they had beds. But think about it, is that if I were to tell you, like, well, I'm going to, sleep in this corner here and, wake me up in 7 hours, you're going to feel sore after a while. But when you're weightless in space, you no longer feel that gravity of everything on your muscles just pulling you down in cramps and whatnot. So whenever they actually got to find a nice little cozy corner, they're like, oh yeah, this actually feels nice. How about that? And then the lunar landing module. So all of these would certainly be taken apart and then squished back together at some point. So you would detach the lunar lander, and then it would rejoin with the command module later. So let's take a look at our astronauts. We had Major General Michael Collins. So he was the pilot the whole time, so he actually never got to land on the moon. He never got to touch foot on the moon. I feel like a lot of people say, like, oh, look, all the astronauts got to touch on the moon. No, he made sure that he was able to pick them up. He was the ultimate Uber at that point. We had Colonel Buzz Aldrin, so everyone remembers Buzz, he's still very much alive and well. He still goes to a lot of public lectures around the nation as well. And then we had Lieutenant Neil Armstrong. So he was actually the very first person to put the footprint on the moon. So notice, though, that all of these had been in some sort of Gemini project as well, so they were well aware of all the pretty buttons, they were aware of the operations, they were aware of just aware of the system in general. So they really got to push forward with Apollo 11. So now I'm going to go through the mission timeline. This is actually really quite interesting to see from a standpoint of how quickly they really had to get through all of their experiments on the moon. And then even just traveling there and getting back. It truly only took a couple days. Either so many people think, oh, they spent days on the moon. No, actually only just a couple hours. Only a couple hours on the moon. So all this information actually can be found on the transcripts. So the transcripts can be found on the NASA Historic Archives. So I poured through, it's over 600 pages worth of transcripts. I left all the technical details out, but I do have some really fun quotes to share with you guys later. So let's hop on board with the Saturn V rocket, which was still a fairly new model at the time, but certainly one of the more powerful rockets in that time, and certainly still considered one of the more powerful ones now. So we're going to have liftoff at 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. Liftoff. Here we go. So truly already at a minute, you're reaching 767 miles per hour. That is fast. That's just Mach 1. So translunar injection means that you are straight for the course, just going right for the moon. You're on target, already there. So it's amazing to go from 1 minute going that fast to nearly just 3 hours and you're hitting your course. That's day 1. And already day 4, you're finally into lunar orbit. So it truly takes a little time. You're carrying all that fuel with you just to get you there. And then you want to get into moon's gravity. Once you get into moon's gravity, then the rest of it, you just kind of slow down, you kind of ease into it, and everything's hunky-dory. So this is all from the transcripts as well. They'll say every once in a while, like, okay, you're at this distance going this velocity, and then this distance at this velocity, and so on. So, whoops. So this is the halfway point between Earth and the moon. So notice that just to get out of Earth's gravity field, and then you can just slow down and ease right into the moon's orbit there. So already day 5, going from day 4 to day 5, we want to detach the command module and the lunar module. So you have the lunar module. This has jettisoned off. So astronaut Collins would be able to go out to the window and take a quick picture and make sure that this was all fun. This wasn't leaking anything into space. So this was truly the check to make sure everything was fine. And then truly only 2 hours later from this picture of, okay, you're fine, land, okay. See you in a couple hours. You landed. So it wasn't just an easy plop either. They actually had a slight complication. They didn't realize how rough the lunar surface was. So as they were starting to land, they do have a little tiny bit of boosters just in case. And they actually had to use some of that fuel because as they were starting to land, they were like, oh no, this seems a little too rough. So they just kind of glided for a while. So this was them just kind of gliding around, making sure that they're going to land in a nice, fairly smooth spot. And they finally did. They finally landed. So you see the shadow here. This is out from their window of their of their lunar module there. So already day 6. Keep in mind, though, that this is actually Earth days, though. So there is a deal with, like, well, what's the lunar time and so on and so forth. Though. So day 6, as of Houston, going, did you make it? You already got your first TV picture, which was interesting how they did that, actually. I wish they took pictures of how they did it, but what you did is that you would have a lunar module, and you still stayed inside, but they had almost like little slides, like evacuation slides out of airplanes. They would just kind of pull a little cord and a little slide would shoot out, and you would slide the camera down and make sure that the camera's pointing at you. And then they would have to check for the camera feed, make sure that it was still pretty good resolution. You can go through the transcripts, and they were trying to fix their resolution of the TV and whatnot. But finally, they got to their first TV picture, right into the famous quote, finally stepping on it on the moon, the United States flag planted right onto the moon as well, which also gave a bit of a complication as well. So the thing about the flag and the pole is that as you're standing it up, they actually had a bit of a trouble. Now there's no wind, so it's not like it's going to be windy and go like, oh no, we can't do anything about it. But also the ground was not soft enough. So the ground is so compact, it's like packed flour. You can barely get yourself onto it. So they could not just go as they thought they did. But instead, the flagpole is actually just a pole, and then they put rocks around it. So very good ingenuity from there. So if you were to actually see the flags now, they would all be whited out. So because the moon does not have an atmosphere, all those sun rays are actually completely bleaching out all the colors out of the flags. So every single flag that is on the surface right now is just completely whited out. So some nice fun pictures again out of the NASA Historic Archives. So this is from one of the cameras on the slide off to the side, and then you get Armstrong climbing down the ladder. And this was apparently a very fun thing for them to do, is that they would step and then take a picture, and then they'd do a few more steps and then take a picture. And it may seem silly, but at the same time, it was actually really good for us geologists to get back these pictures, because then we can figure out how compact this actually was. It really does look like flour with like a very solid imprint. And these boots are weighted for a reason. Again, weightlessness. You barely have any surface pressure on the moon. You can just kind of bouncing around kind of deal. If you were to look at videos, not from Apollo 11, but from, I believe, Apollo 15 and 16, if you were to look at YouTube videos, you can see them just kind of bouncing around and stuff. But they are just kicking up dust and dust and dust. So just a nearby crater. This got interesting as well. They went through geology field training before doing any of this. So you had a scientist named Eugene Shoemaker, Dr. Eugene Shoemaker, out of Lowell Observatory in Arizona. So he was basically their field guide for at least a couple years, I believe. But what happened is that none of these astronauts are geologists. Fun fact, we've only had one geologist on the moon. And what is the moon full of? Rocks. So yes, we've only had one astronaut on the moon, and that was the last Apollo mission, Apollo 17. So these guys really had to go through a lot of geologic training, so that way they can transmission back what are they describing, instead of just going, oh, look, a big hole. Okay, thanks for the update. As a geologist, we would not be happy with that whatsoever. So they really had to figure out how to describe certain craters. Now, at this time, 1969, impact craters were still a very largely unknown thing. We know impact craters. You have just some giant big rock from the sky and go boop and make a hole. Simple, easy as that. Problem is that we've never realized the process behind it. We just always assumed that these were actually collapses, that the whole moon would be full of volcanoes and they would just be collapse pits. We see those quite often, especially around Hawaii and Iceland. But to actually have some sort of impact crater, they would collect rocks, and then what is inside those rocks can then be telling you like, oh, okay, it's this kind of mineral that's got to be from an impact, and so on and so forth. So Eugene Shoemaker actually helped us figure out that meteor crater out in, or Barringer crater is also what it's called, out in Arizona. He was on site to help figure out some of the minerals involved with that being an impact crater. That, for the longest time, thought that was a volcanic collapse. out in the middle of nowhere, Arizona. There's no other volcano. Well, there is a small volcano just a little bit south of that, though. But still, we just assumed, okay, it's a big, giant collapse. But nope, there is special, very, very specific minerals in those impacts that can only be done by impacts. So then you have equipment, so then they would have to walk a few yards in different directions around there, make sure that they're still around the vicinity of their lunar module. Each one having different kinds of instruments. So you would have plasma instruments, you would have a seismic instrument as well. And I'll go through the list here in a bit. This is one of the seismic instruments here, so you had some nice solar panels. And it's also blocking some of the radiation of that. So you would just kind of lightly set it down and see if there's any moonquakes going on. So actually all of this data is out in Berkeley, California. So you actually have to ask for permission to get the data, but they can share it. And then you can see the flag in the background there. Yep, there's our flag with a whole bunch of footprints around. Like that. Then they also held a plaque that also had Nixon's signature on it as well. It had all the 3 astronauts' signatures on it, and then the 2 hemispheres of the Earth. So really nice little plaque. Alrighty, so back to our day 6, going from that TV picture, one small step, flag deployed, already from hour 110 to hour 124, they're gone. So they truly had to step out, take all the pictures, collect as much rocks as they can back into the lunar module, and up they go. Woof. And then only 4 hours later, here comes my astronaut Michael Collins with the command module, and then they were able to click right back in and back into their shuttle, like Lego pieces. So almost a day later, you go into trans-Earth, which means Earth locked on target, away they go. All the way to day 9. So from day 7 to day 9, you would go into immediate atmospheric entry, splashdown, recovery. Just boom, 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 all within an hour. It's really, really screaming fast. So as soon as they get into a recovery ship, they didn't experience as much muscle atrophy as many of our astronauts do now, because they're out in space much longer than just a couple hours. So they did get into the recovery ship, but they then got immediately into quarantine. So you have Houston celebrating the success. This was at the time when they just got recovered during their splashdown. And then this is them in quarantine saying hello to their wives, so they couldn't get out for quite a few hours worth. So they're like, oh, hello, we wish we can hug, but no, we can't. And then even the President Nixon at the time was just like, hi guys, and we're in quarantine still. So hello from this tiny box. But yes, they were finally released from quarantine. Luckily, everything was fine. All right, so fun times on the moon. I wanted to share some fun quotes out of the transcripts, and it took me quite some time. Actually, it took me quite a few days to narrow this section down of my lecture, because going through 600 plus transcripts where more than half of it is just technical. All right, like every single button that they press, they would have to relay it out to Houston to answer back. Or, hey, should we turn on this oxygen tank to this much PSI? Hey, Houston, and then Houston's answer, and just on and on and on. So I only grabbed the certain fun parts of the transcripts. I also would have liked to have included the geology technical babble too, but surprisingly, there really wasn't that much until later transcripts, at least with Apollo 15 and 16, there's a lot more geology. So this one only had maybe like 2 paragraphs, so I'm sticking with the really fun ones. So there for a while, as they're getting into their translunar, they got tired of just seeing the ocean. And so they just kind of got almost a little too anxious that they're like, oh my gosh, we're in space, oh, look at the Earth. But there's no land. Okay, well, hey, Houston. They were just kind of cracking jokes and stuff like that, though. And then Capcom, which is Houston at that point, is just like, nope. Gonna have to stick with water. We can't control the Earth. Have fun, boys. This I found interesting. They would actually read newspaper headlines to the astronauts, whether it was, they were actually all baseball fans. So you had a lot of baseball scores and stats relayed back and forth from Houston to the astronauts. So I skipped the baseball fun. But there were also some interesting other things at this time period that it's not really in the history books, and I kind of wish it was, though. So the vice president of President Nixon at the time actually wanted to put a man on Mars by the year 2000. This is 1969, and he just assumed, oh, look at that, we're already putting men on the moon, this is going to be great. If our trajectory of technology goes this fast, we're going to totally be on Mars by the year 2000. It's going to be great. Well, no. This got interesting, too. You had the hippie movement as well. So in Texas, they were refused tourist cards because they needed to take a bath and a haircut. This is hysterical. This is amazing. The hippie movement at the time. This next quote really got me. I actually had to reread it because I wasn't sure if I was actually reading it correctly. But it got interesting. So in London, apparently there was an American submarine that had to promise not to harm the Loch Ness Monster. And that if the submarine were to take a tissue sample, that they were to retrieve it carefully and to make sure that it's not going to be involved with the 1876 Cruelty to Animals Act. But would it really? Because it's cryptozoology. Does it exist? We don't know. If it does, can we take a tissue sample? I just found this so hysterical. And the astronauts' reaction to that was just kind of like, yeah, good luck with that. Have fun, London. There was also an interesting phenomenon, too, where they would actually see a certain angle of the Earth with the sun. And they mentioned how if you just see the ocean, there would just be this huge blob of grayish color. So they would try to figure it out, and they realized, okay, it's actually just their point of view of the sun bouncing off the Earth's atmosphere. So this actually marked an interesting phenomenon that all the Apollo astronauts then documented from there. So Houston was very much like, yep, okay, you know what, we've seen the same thing. Gemini and Mercury astronauts have kind of seen the same thing. They didn't get as high up, though. So yeah, we've seen the same thing. Aldrin, however, was like, there's got to be an official term for this, right? A lot of gray paint. Nope, we have no name for this phenomenon. We still don't have a name for this phenomenon. It's just angle and reflection. But this is essentially what they're looking at, is that the ocean no longer looks a very pretty blue. It's actually kind of like a slate gray color. Actually looks more gray on my computer screen, but you get the idea. This one I found interesting. They were going to land in Sea of Fertility, and they were kind of making a joke of like, oh, why are we landing in the Sea of Fertility when there's no corn there? There's no plants. They were like, why is this even named? And then Houston was like, actually, fun fact, here we go. It was named after a very early cartographer under the King of Spain, and he made one of the more accurate maps of the moon and named it that. And then they're like, oh, well, a lot better than the Sea of Crises. Absolutely. Could be a lot worse. Rather be at the Sea of Fertility than the Sea of Crises. So this is where they landed, Apollo 11. And then later on, we would try to land in most of the dark spots on the moon as well. They're actually very nice and smoother compared to the lighter objects you have around. This one was interesting. The Chinese actually contacted Houston, and they're like, oh, can you relive our legend here? There is actually a bit of a legend where you have a girl with a rabbit seen to be on the moon named Chang'o. to be living there for 4,000 years. And the astronauts were just kind of like, really? Okay, sure, we'll keep an eye on the bunny girl. Absolutely, okay. All right, so that's enough fun quotes for now, though. So what have we brought into our knowledge from Apollo 11? What has Apollo 11 given us as far as the planetary community goes? So there were quite a bit of lunar experiments done right at the surface. They collected 47 pounds of moon rocks. So this is actually a little bit less compared to the future Apollo astronauts because their spacesuits at the time didn't have enough pockets. Later on, other Apollo missions actually had a lot more pockets around, even around their arms and around their legs, that they would just pick up a rock and, oh, okay, do I have a rock in this pocket? Nope, okay, I could put it in this pocket, in my shoe. No, not really. They can't take off their shoes. They would do soil analysis, so instead of just picking up rocks, they would take like little shovelfuls and then put them in a tight sealed baggie. And then solar wind, all that radiation. We still were very curious about how much radiation is on the moon with no atmosphere. These are instruments that were left on the moon, so the passive seismic experiment, so moonquakes. Unfortunately, that particular instrument is no longer working. The laser ranging, so you would, if anybody's seen the very early episodes of The Big Bang Theory, they actually mentioned this particular retroreflector where you can actually point a laser to a very specific time and angle of the moon, and then you can pretty much have it angle right back to you, and you can time the distance between the Earth and the moon. So it's actually still a really fun experiment to do. It just involves a mirror. And then the lunar dust detector, so they want to figure out, okay, there is no atmosphere, like I just said, but there could still be solar wind to pick up some of that dust. Or even from impacts as well. So a whole bunch of samples. To a geologist, we see these names constantly on North's side and breccia and basalt and whatnot. So basalt is really interesting for that particular part of the moon because basalt is essentially volcanic rock. So this is where it finally led us to believe that all that dark area may actually be very dead lava fields. So whenever I say volcano, you're probably thinking of a giant mountain of doom and fire and smoke and lava and whatnot, right? But on the moon, however, that's not the case. Apparently there's a theory going around where you have just kind of a nice smooth surface of the Earth, and then you just kind of bombard it enough times, it's going to poke a hole and kind of bleed out. It's going to bleed lava. So essentially that's what this basalt is. And then breccia just means just a whole bunch of rocks kind of spotty like that and whatnot. So to a geologist, I'm like, ooh, rocks, but pretty rocks and whatnot. So most of these rocks you would have to study very, very carefully. You could actually request to do research with some of these rocks. You have to put in so much paperwork, hand it in to the vault is what we call it. And then you would get a box and a box and a box and a box of the lunar sample. You would have to wear gloves at all times. You have to wear a face mask at all times. You have to make sure that you're dealing with a very sealed environment and make sure that it's not going to just oxygen contaminating the sample. It's a huge, long process. But the fun part is with these kinds of rocks, and luckily it's been done several times that we don't have to do it terribly much, is that you can take little tiny itty-bitty slices of these moon rocks. So what you do is that when you take these itty-bitty, very, very thin slices, you can put it under a microscope and shine a light under it, and then you can see what kind of minerals are in that particular rock sample. So this particular rock sample has this kind of thin section, so not too bad. A bit anorthositic, so which means just kind of dark, a lot of blue type minerals around and whatnot. So kind of pretty, all right. But then you have this one, a little bit lighter color here than the previous one though. So this has a little bit more feldspar to it. It can have a little bit more olivine to it. So a lot brighter colors with this particular moon rock. Really pretty. So all the really pretty orange and blue colors are usually with olivine or what you guys may know as olivine is also peridot, if anybody is a August birthstone there. You could also see the differences between how big some of these grains are versus they almost look very spiky in this one and so on. There's gobs of these pictures of thin sections all over the place. They're really, really pretty to look at. So again, what have we learned? Moon rocks could also give us hints for any kind of that kind of magma going on. Unfortunately, we still haven't reached the entire surface of the moon, but we just kind of assume, okay, you know, if we found it in that kind of dark spot, and then every other Apollo mission also found basaltic rocks as well, then we're just kind of like, okay, that's a fair assumption then. Impact cratering, like I said, the moon is a natural satellite of the Earth. Again, this was still an unknown thing in the 1970s, early 1970s. So how they were able to figure out, oh, it's a natural satellite, is because all the rocks matched that of the Earth's crust just fine. Matched it perfectly. So then we were like, oh, okay, the moon has got to be ours. It's not a captured thing. If it were a captured thing, we would have completely different rocks. So now there's quite a bit of work to still be done in lunar science. There's a lot to learn about it. We're still learning about the volcanism of all of this. And interestingly enough, it wasn't actually just that long ago why we figured that all of this is actually on only this side of the moon and not the other side. That's because of that tidal lock. It really wasn't that long ago that we figured that out. Hey, we figured out, okay, the far side of the moon is horribly cratered, horribly cratered. But when you're in tidal lock, you're essentially pulling the gravity on the inside of the moon forward toward you. So all of that magma activity on the inside of the moon is essentially bringing forth on that toward us. We're still learning about the chemistry and the soil going on. Ice. There are what's called permanently shadowed regions on the moon. So there is actually ice, not necessarily in the caps, usually around in these latitudes here though. But you would have craters that would never see the light of day whatsoever. So you would actually have pockets of ice just completely shadowed. So that could be an interesting reservoir for if we wanted to build colonies on the moon. You know, freshest water in the solar system right there. If it's completely shadowed and never touching the sun, it's never going to get radiation. Or so says the theories and the models. And lava tubes. So if all of this has magma, there's got to be some sort of lava tubes to filter all that magma back up and whatnot. So lava tubes could actually be really interesting for astronaut protection. It's basically caving. You would hardly have any radiation going on. You'd be completely protected. And as long as it doesn't collapse on you, it should be fine. So there are quite a bit of current lunar missions going either around or actually landed on the moon. So the only couple that are actually on the moon are Chang'e 4 and the U2 rover. Chang'e 5 is en route. Chinese has a lot of missions going on. Our Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has been there for quite a few years now. We have the LROC camera, which is the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter camera. Great name. So gave us all of our beautiful, beautiful pictures that usually NASA brings out to the press and to the public comes from Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. So we actually do have a lot to look forward to, but unfortunately none of them manned at this time. But quite a few robotic ones. You have the Indian Space Agency, the Chinese as well, NASA, and ESA, the European Space Agency. We want to do more with CubeSats, which would be fantastic. We've done CubeSats for quite some time with Earth. Why not do it with the moon as well? So CubeSats are adorable. They're only this big. They're really tiny, itty-bitty satellites. But with our technology, we can very much downsize so many experiments into those little tiny cubes and basically deploy them out and about, and they could do their own experiments and whatnot. So there's a plan to at least do 13 with ESA with that. The red stars here are actually private industries. So private companies are certainly making their way on the forefront. SpaceX, we have SpaceX, but they have essentially at this point no plans for the moon. We have Moon Express instead. That's a whole different deal as well. And then South Korea is actually wanting to do their own lunar orbiter as well. So we're supporting them as well. But essentially, we have to go back. At some point, we really do have to go back. I kind of hate the media for constantly going, oh, we're going to go to Mars. It's like, well, our technology has changed so much from this time point, and we haven't been back to the moon since the late 70s. At that point, our technology has completely expanded so much from that time period that, sure, I'm pretty sure we can get to the moon, but we should probably make sure we can still get to the moon safely. So we should go back to the moon, and then we'll make our way to Mars. There are quite a lot of fun stuff to do about the moon still. The Curator is where you can go look at the lunar samples and look at those thin sections. There's pages and pages of really pretty microscope pictures and whatnot. The Astronomical League here in the US does a lunar observation program where you can go out with a telescope or binoculars and you can document certain craters as you observe them, kind of deal. So it's a nice like little observation practice if ever you want to bring out your telescope from the garage or something. This is where you would get the transcripts. So they have all the Apollo mission transcripts on that website as well. I highly recommend the Astronaut Wives Club as well, so you get to see the point of view of what they went through and how did they handle the media, and certainly Apollo 13 scenario as well. But thank you guys so much for joining me here today. I actually have some really fun stuff to show you guys after any kind of Q&A you guys may have, though. But thank you guys so much for Apollo 50th anniversary. Yes?
The tubes, are those theoretical, or have they actually found them, like with some of the exploratory instruments and stuff?
So not necessarily exploratory per se. I'm going to answer that with a yes. With a yes, they're theoretical, and yes, we may have observed them. So there is still a possibility that they don't exist. We do have some geologic images where it looks like that they should be tunnels, but we don't necessarily know if they're caves. They can just be bumps, or they can be just kind of uplifts. We don't know. We haven't been close enough to one yet, but we have seen them quite all over the place, actually. But by images, we just keep missing them with the Apollo missions. So that would be nice to know if they would be caves, because all the geology that can be involved with those caves would be great. Or space, or cave worms. You know, that's always a risk. Yes.
How did the astronauts determine what would be good rock samples to bring back? I mean, obviously they were limited by size, but
It's essentially, does it look shiny and pretty? It's essentially you take a kid to a playground and it's like, oh, I like this rock. I was definitely that kind of kid. Nope, it was essentially just by sight. You would try to get as much different kind of color variations and different sizes and thank you. Maybe different kinds of like grain sizes too and whatnot. So try to get as many colors as you can. The more interesting samples by far have probably been from the Apollo 17 mission, though. They actually made note to Houston going, why is the soil orange? And for the longest time, everybody, even the geologists, were like, what? Why is it orange? Why are you telling us it's orange? We've never had an orange sample before. And turns out it was actually just how they angled the soil sample to see it from the sun angle to make it look orange. It was actually a very dark brown. Because when they brought it back, they're like, oh, they opened up the bag and they're like, no, it's brown, it's not orange. What are you doing? And all the geologists are like, no. But then they realized, oh, okay, there was a certain kind of glass in that soil sample that would actually reflect the sun differently. So, yep, it's very much by chance of, you hope that they get good samples. Yes?
In an earlier picture, it was like a really close-up with a 2 millimeter grid on it. One of the things that was labeled was like some kind of a round thing, like a ball bearing.
Oh, probably.
Yeah,
This one?
Up in the upper left there.
Oh, this one there?
Right next to it.
Oh, right here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, impact glass spheral. So this would, yeah. So this would actually be used as more of it's more for geochemists. So what they would do is that this was kind of their standard. So they would do as much chemistry measurements out of this, and then they would test to see, do any of these match the chemistry of that particular impact glass. So we grounded it for sure. That's not a particular that perfectly round found on the moon. Nope, that was just our standard. Probably size too.
The little ball thing is not from the moon.
No. So impact glass we could actually find here on Earth, which is fun. So it's the same thing as like tektite. So tektites, you can, they're very pretty dark, usually black or dark brown glass, and you can actually carve it, make it spherical and stuff like that. They're usually not naturally spherical though. Yes.
Do you have any photos of the far side of the moon?
Not in my PowerPoint, but I can certainly pull up a picture. I think this thing has internet. Yeah. So it's really quite interesting to see the far side of the moon. Let's see if this mouse works. That is bright. Now, if I type in far side of the moon, how many Pink Floyd lyrics? Yeah, okay. The pointer is not a mouse. Here we go. Yeah, so quite cratered. So hardly any dark spots. You have a few here and there, but usually in much deeper depressions, whereas the other side, the true side of the moon that we have are not giant depressions. So just all sorts of craters and craters and craters and craters. Really quite pretty. Yeah.
So I was wondering, I was asking for your opinion. Do you believe that there could be life or bacteria and other living organisms in the ice on the moon, if there was ice?
Oh, goodness. Well, there is ice on the moon, which is cool. Let's see, probably not alive anymore. If there were to be bacteria, more than likely. That's truly a never say never. Bacteria more than likely have existed on a very tiny baby Earth where the crust of the moon has been brought forth. So yeah, there could be itty bitty fossils in that ice and just completely compacted in that. You could also have impacts on the Earth, and all that spraying of material can actually get to the moon. That is actually a current theory right now. As far as the amount, probably not. I'd say go further out in the solar system where there's actually a lot more salt. And where the water is actually warmer. Yeah, so like Enceladus and Europa. That's probably the best bet for maybe alive bacteria, which would be really cool. Yeah.
The instrument that was measuring the moon quakes that you said is, doesn't work anymore.
Mm-hmm.
How long did it work, and what did it discover? What did they learn from it?
Right, absolutely. So the first one probably only lasted for about 2 to 3 years, so that was actually a pretty good standpoint, but then eventually the circuits just kind of die out. But every single Apollo mission had their own seismic instruments. What we discovered is that the moon doesn't have large magnitude 9 moonquakes like we kind of wanted, but then that would be kind of weird and scary if the moon actually had those large magnitude moonquakes. What we did instead find out that the perfect way to describe it from a geologist that was one of the first to read the data was that a moonquake rang like a bell, which meant whenever you have an impact on the moon, the energy waves out of that impact would actually just kind of bounce around, whereas earthquakes don't do that. Earthquakes bounce off of our core, and that's how we're actually able to figure out that there was a core. There's an inner core and an outer core and a mantle and so on. We found that out through earthquakes. But with moonquakes, if this is bouncing around all over the place like ringing a bell, we're like, oh, okay, there's no core, there's no steady core, there's no hard center in the moon. Yeah.
In previous talks, you expressed skepticism about establishing Mars colonies. Do you think our prospects will be better on the moon for a colony?
I hope so. As far as resources go, yeah. I don't know. The ice would be nice. The dust is not as fun to play with as it is on Mars. But Mars is still very much dangerous. So that's my only catch with this. At least the moon is close enough for us to go, if something were to go wrong, we're able to send our people back. But as far as Mars goes, no, we still have a lot of interesting geologic kinks to work out with Mars. By all means, we still have a radiation problem here, but you don't have wind. You don't have a wind problem here. Whereas on Mars, you do. Global dust storms and whatnot. So at least the moon would be safer. But as far as resources go, there's some nice metals on the moon. There's like traces of titanium on the moon, but maybe not enough to build an igloo, a lunar igloo. That'd be really fun. There is talk about doing 3D printing though for habitats. Although they're doing that more for Mars, but I wish they would do that for the moon. That'd be really nice. Yes.
According to the space author John Logsdon, John F. Kennedy proposed an international mission to the moon at first. What do you think of that idea?
Absolutely. I think the more international collaboration we have, the better. We certainly have the technology, and we're starting to rely more on the European Space Agency. They certainly have a lot of really cool ideas. We just have more technological power to actually lift it off the ground. Some of our launch stations are actually much more better located, so certainly why we use Florida, Houston, California. European Space Agency, they have nowhere to launch from except either to use the US or they have to go all the way down to French Guiana. They sometimes do, yeah, if they ask politely, yes. But the Russians are very much bringing their a completely different space agency called Roscosmos. So Roscosmos is kind of getting back on its feet. There for a while, the Russians were just kind of in a lull on space exploration. They actually were more concerned about Earth. So solar plasmas, all the plasma radiation that the Earth can get, all of our atmosphere sciences, they were pretty much more on the forefront than we were. But now they're wanting to pick up a little bit more with their space, so Roscosmos is certainly making a comeback. But having different kinds of international partners, absolutely, that would be fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. All right, then if there's no more questions, then thank you guys so much, and I will show you guys my fun little rock surprises here. Thank you.